For almost 50 years, the world was literally split down the middle, not by a shooting war, but by a Cold War, this 40-year ideological slugfest between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And it defined pretty much everything about the second half of the 20th century. All right, let's get into it. And just like that, with those few words, Winston Churchill gave a name to the divide that was carving up the world. You know, it was the perfect metaphor for this new reality. A planet of two opposing camps, separated by this wall of suspicion, of fear, an invisible but totally solid barrier. So, how in the world did this happen? How did the Allies who had just won World War II turn on each other so fast? Well, this first chapter is all about that. How that wartime alliance just shattered and turned into this deep, bitter hostility. When you boil it all down, this was a fight over two completely opposite ways of seeing the world. You had the West championing capitalism, individual freedoms, free markets. And then you had the East pushing communism, where the state controlled the economy and the group was everything. These weren't just different economic theories, they were completely different blueprints for how to live. And things got heated fast. You can just see the dominoes falling here. In 47, the Truman Doctrine basically drew a line in the sand. Then, in 48, you have the Berlin Airlift, this huge standoff. But in 1949, wow, 1949 was the real game changer. First, NATO was formed, a formal military alliance aimed right at the Soviets. And then, just a few months later, the Soviets test their own atomic bomb. Suddenly, the arms race was on. So, the American game plan came down to one single, powerful idea: containment. It was pretty straightforward, really. Don't go to war with the Soviet Union, but do everything you can to stop communism from spreading anywhere else. The thinking was, if you could just keep it boxed in, the whole Soviet system was so broken it would eventually just rot from the inside. And that one idea, it drove American policy for the next 40 years. Okay, so now we get to the part where things get, well, honestly, terrifying. This is the era of nuclear terror, where both sides are just piling up these world-ending weapons, and the entire planet is forced to live with a constant, nagging fear of total annihilation. And nothing captures that feeling better than October of 1962. For 13 straight days, the entire world just held its breath. This wasn't some movie plot. This was real life. The absolute closest we have ever come to wiping ourselves off the map. And here's how it went down. It starts with this unbelievable discovery. American spy planes find Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. I mean, just 90 miles from Florida. So what does President Kennedy do? He makes a huge gamble. Not an invasion, but a naval quarantine to block any more missiles. As you can imagine, tensions go through the roof. The US military goes to DEFCON 2. That is literally the last step before all-out nuclear war. It was only a desperate, secret deal that pulled us back from the edge at the very last second. And out of this crisis comes this totally insane, but weirdly logical idea: mutually assured destruction. Or, perfectly, mad. The logic was twisted, but it kind of worked. Because both sides knew that if they launched their missiles, they'd be completely wiped out by a retaliatory strike. Nobody dared to be the first to push the button. So, in the strangest way possible, the threat of total destruction is what kept the peace. So, with direct war off the table, the conflict had to change. The superpowers started fighting each other indirectly through these proxy wars in smaller countries. But at the very same time, something else was happening. They started a period of détente, basically a thawing of those ice-cold tensions. And this table just lays out the story of containment in Asia perfectly. In Korea, after a really brutal war, you get a stalemate. Communism was contained north of the 38th parallel. So, in that sense, mission accomplished. But Vietnam was a whole different story. The same goal led to this long, agonizing war that the US ultimately lost. Containment failed, and the conflict just tore American society apart. The constant fear of MAD, the insane cost of the arms race, it all pushed both sides to finally sit down and talk. And in 1972, they signed the SALT I Treaty. It was a big deal. It basically froze the number of certain nuclear missiles, and it kicked off this official period of détente. But while the diplomats were shaking hands, people were still dying in these proxy wars. And this number, 58,000, it's just a gut punch. That's how many Americans died in Vietnam. A war that didn't just fail in its mission, it created these deep wounds back home that took decades to heal. So that thaw in relations, well, it didn't last. It was always fragile. And then in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the whole thing just came crashing down. That single event kicked off what a lot of people call the Second Cold War, and things got very confrontational and very dangerous all over again. And if you want to know what this new era sounded like, just listen to Ronald Reagan. The language here is incredible. He's not talking about competitors or rivals anymore. He's calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. The whole conflict was being painted in these stark moral terms again. It was good versus evil. So it was Reagan's plan. He called it peace through strength. And that meant, first and foremost, a massive, massive hike in defense spending. It meant proposing this futuristic missile defense shield that everybody called Star Wars. The idea wasn't just to match the Soviets, it was to launch a brand new, high-tech arms race that he believed their broken economy just couldn't possibly win. All right, and now for the final act, which played out in a way that almost nobody saw coming. And the story starts not in Washington, but in Moscow, with the rise of a new kind of Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He's the guy who, trying to save the system, accidentally ended up destroying it. See, Gorbachev wasn't stupid. He knew the Soviet Union was on the ropes, so he rolled out these two huge reforms to try and fix it. Perestroika, which meant restructuring the economy a bit, and glasnost, which meant openness. He wanted people to be able to talk honestly about the system's problems, but glasnost was like opening Pandora's box. Once you let people start criticizing, they don't want to stop. And what happened next was just breathtaking. It all happened so fast. In 1989, country after country in Eastern Europe just threw off Soviet rule. Then, on November 9th, the unthinkable happens. The Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, comes down. A year later, Germany is one country again. And finally, in 91, a last-gasp coup by communist hardliners in Moscow fails miserably, and that was the end of the line. And with these words, on Christmas Day 1991, it was officially over. Mikhail Gorbachev went on TV and resigned. The Soviet Union was dissolved. This 40-year global conflict that had defined generations, it didn't end with a big battle, but with a televised speech. The Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the very last time. But you have to ask, right? The Cold War as we knew it, that's over. But in a world where we're still arguing about democracy versus authoritarianism, about different economic models, has that fundamental battle of ideas ever really gone away? That's definitely something to think about.